Thanks, Tom. I was about to launch into my sermon, as Tom said, a series called Come Together, and I realised that that wouldn't really be very fair on my friend Tom, because Tom's actually going to be flicking some slides, and he would have been running frantically down to the back trying to get to that slide on time, which would have been quite funny, actually, when I think about it right now, but my compassionate side rather than my joking side won out, Tom. Thank you for all that you do, my friend. I was sorting through a number of photos. I'd done a dump of my my phone, and my family had been away on a bit of a holiday at the start of December, and I'd done a dump of, you know how it is these days, you have hundreds and hundreds of photos, and you make the crime of keeping hundreds and hundreds of photos, and so you never look at them. And so I was doing a massive cull and working through all these photos, and I stumbled across a few other ones which I had there from the past. A few of them were from last year's father-child camp. If you're new to this kind of community, it's a camp that we do, a camping weekend, normally early May. I'm going to give it a plug here at the moment, which has men and children. And the only kind of rules is that we just don't tell the women what happens on the weekend. That's kind of one of the rules. And as I was doing it, I was flicking through the photos, and I found what has become in recent times one of the great kind of features of the father-child weekend is that on the Saturday night, when we light these Chinese lanterns, and across the beautiful, it's normally held up at Alexandra near kind of Lake Eildon, we light these Chinese lanterns, and against the dark sky, there's no kind of that light pollution that you get in the city. Against the kind of the stars and the trees, these lanterns fly into the sky. And kids and the children in each of the adults is kind of like in this beautiful sense of awe and wonder. It's become kind of like a semi-tradition. But it's not quite, I think, the oldest tradition. Because really the oldest tradition that's part of Father-Child Weekend is the bonfire. And these are memorable bonfires. They are big bonfires. The kids spend a Saturday afternoon collecting sort of like old dead firewood and trees from different areas and piling into the area. Normally, the expectation, the hope, is that it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 10 metres high. And someone normally manages to get like a long stick and put someone's hat on top of the stick. So when the fire starts to crackle and the heat starts to fly, the hat will fly off in the air as well. It's a large fire that generates so much heat that you feel like, you can't be... You feel like you've got to stand as far away from me as you guys are in the morning. You've got to be quite a distance away. Who doesn't love a bonfire? I don't know many people who don't love a bonfire. Toasted marshmallows, relaxed conversations, and often slightly deeper conversations. It's almost like it's somewhat soothing, like sitting beside the water or something like that, isn't it, around a fire like that? And as you watch the fire burn down from the initial heat and fury, the coals begin to quiver, don't they? It's almost mesmerising how they do it. Somehow, hours after the fire is lit, the heat is still very real. But inevitably, of course, it's time to put the fire out. Water, sand, and probably most importantly, space. Space is what's needed to put the fire out, because once you begin to separate the coals from each other, they lose their ability to retain heat, don't they? So we kind of spread them out in that way. Like penguins in the Antarctic that huddle close to survive, when the fire is close to each other, they keep warm but spread them out, and they lose it quickly. Everybody, when they are close to someone else, can feel that warmth, but spread them out, separate them, and they begin, in a sense, to die like coals. For life, we know that we need each other. We need each other to encourage, to support. It's better to laugh when we're with others. It's better to eat when we're with others. It's better to work when we're with others. And it doesn't matter, I've got to say, it doesn't matter whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, we're better together. Yes, there are times when we need space, we all need that, but we know that we're not created to be hermits. In fact, it's not good to be alone. And lockdowns for physical safety have been important, but there has been a price to pay. You know it, don't you? You've experienced it as much as I have. Father-child was one of the few times we were able to gather in any real numbers last year. I miss that. Do you? Miss being with others? What else would, in a sense, you say that you had missed? My dear wife is still in her 40s because lockdown birthdays don't count. Life is meant to be shared. Church life is meant to be shared. The problem is that so much in our community these days, in our world, in our Western world, has moved away from that sense of being together, about being a part of things, being a part of community, sharing life together, because the last years, and I'm talking really from post-World War II, has seen the rise of the individual. I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago that expressed this in kind of like a highly intelligent way about the cultural changes that have happened since that time. Here's a quote from it. It says that freedom has increasingly been defined as autonomy. Autonomy, the word, literally means to be a law unto yourself. Auto means self, nomos means law. Historically, human fulfillment and meaning was understood to be found not in a quest to find our own singular happiness, but in seeking the happiness of families and communities through relationships and roles in which the group's common good was made more important than one's individual self-interest. You hear that? The rise of the individual over the community. And most of us here have grown up in Western societies, and Western societies operate on the personal preferences. They operate on personal plans. If you don't want food, you don't eat it. If you don't want to wait at some place, you leave it. If you have a preference, you ask for it. In the West, the individual is king. Life is about me, the individual, and my search for fulfillment. Historically, human fulfillment and meaning was understood to be found not in a quest to find our own singular happiness. This was the past, but now in seeking the happiness of families and communities through relationships and roles in which the group's common good was made more important than the individual. It's lost. It's the world that we live in. It's the world that we work in. It's the world where children go to school in. Where friendships, where communities, where neighbours are built and live these days. So let me ask you today, the individual or the community, which is more important? The individual or the community, which is more important? How do you see the world? Do you see it through your own eyes, or do you see it through others' eyes? I'll give you an example of one of the things that's really hard to fight against. When I read my Bible, and you might find this same thing. Last week, Matt spoke about sharing the good news of Jesus, a mission of God, the mission of God. And in Matthew 28, it says to go and make disciples of all the nations. Who does this verse apply to? Who does it apply to? Because often when I read it, I think it applies to me. But you know what? It doesn't apply to me, it applies to we. In fact, most of the pronouns you in the New Testament are plural. They're not singular. But we read them through Western eyes. We read them as this applies to me as an individual. That becomes our default position. Philippians chapter 1 verse 6 says, I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished. Who's the you? Do we read that as me? And because I've got news for you, it's you. 1 Corinthians 3 says, don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God? This is not me and my individual body. This is we. This is us. This is plural. It's like we have blinders on our eyes, though, because of our life and experience has raised us to think of the individual first. And that has become our focus. And we suffer the consequences. And so in our society, we realise that we have become consumers, not participants. It's about my needs, not other people's needs. In fact, there are a million choices to cater for my needs. Technology has exacerbated it. Families once would sit down and share meals, maybe laugh and talk, and then watch a TV show together. The last 25 years, in fact, I would hazard to guess that the top 100 shows of now in 2022 register far less people watching them than they did 25 years ago. Because there's a million channels. And so everybody can watch what just suits themselves. There's not one TV, there's 3 TVs. In fact, there's not 3 TVs, there's 10 TVs because everybody's got phones or laptops or whatever device it might be. And our past years have only exacerbated this issue, haven't they? Schools have separated and people have been at home. Friend groups have been unable to come together. Church life, we used to gather together to sing, to pray, to share life, and now we watch. We're individuals. And we're paying a price for it. You know, today is not a call for introverts to become extroverts. We all need to recognise our own personal limits. For some people here, I know we love a gathering of hundreds of people. For some, we love a gathering of a few people. But I want to say to each of you that there are many reasons why we need to come together. You think about if you were making a list of why it's important for people to come together. Here's some practical ones that I wrote down on my list. I said, and when we come together, we can accomplish more. You know, some things can only be done with multiple people. If I'm working on a work site with some mates, you need a couple of hands to carry large beams. You can't do it by yourself. Whenever there's a job to be done, we need different people with different skills. We need others to share in life. I need others around me when I sing. I sound pretty good when I'm surrounded by hundreds. Maybe you're the same. I need others around me for warmth. I need others around me for love, both to experience it and to give it. I cannot love another person if I'm by myself. I need people around me to forgive, because I cannot forgive if there's no one else around me. I need others around me when I am to learn patience in my life, because I cannot be patient when I'm just by myself. You know, there is great wisdom in the strange maths equation that 1 + 1 = 3. Because we can accomplish more together. In a sense, the total is greater than the sum of the individual parts. But it's not just about accomplishing, I've got to say. In fact, sometimes it's just simply about sharing experience. I was away this past week with a number of our staff team, having some time of planning, reflection, and I was reminded again about how you build the relationships. Sometimes we build relationships through shared interests. Sometimes it's through shared loves. But other times it's through shared experiences. You simply just do something together. You experience that together. It brings you shared memories. Sharing things is fantastic. I mean, what makes a banquet? Is it great food or great company? Hard to have a banquet when you're alone. What makes for a great concert or a great movie experience? Watching it alone or sharing that experience with someone else? What makes for a great joke? Is it reading it in a book or is it laughing with others? We need to share things to come together and experience them. And the other thing I wrote down was I like to think of myself as a relatively rational person. But when I was writing this down, I wanted to write my third one down, and this is what I wrote. It's going to come up on the screen there, I can see. It's just intuitively right that you share things together. As I mentioned last week, we were out way with our staff team, and we were eating lunch outside on one of the beautiful days. It was either Monday or Tuesday this week. You know, it was glorious weather. And I don't know what it is, I don't know why, but food just tastes better outside. I was eating like a chicken and salad roll. Granted, it was a nice chicken and salad roll, but it wasn't a 5-star chicken and salad roll. But outside just made it better. Now, I'm sure that the chemical makeup of the food was no different than normal, but it just tastes better. Why? I don't know why. It just does. And you know what? When we share life together, when we come together, it is just better. And sometimes I don't know the reason why, it just is. But amongst all this knowing what is right, we find that we are in this fight against what's stopping us from doing that. What do you think stops you from coming together? What prevents you from sharing life with others? Here's the laundry list that our team wrote down. For some, we said it's selfishness. I'm concerned for my needs, not for someone else. For fear, a fear of either people in terms of what that might challenge me about or physical interaction. For some, it's busyness. Well, I've got too much on my plate. Andrew, have you seen my calendar? There are time demands. How do I balance my personal needs, my family needs, my work needs? How do I do it? Some recognise sometimes it's a lack of leadership calling us to come together and providing opportunities for doing it. Someone on our team wrote, unwilling, I don't want to do it. Someone said, apathy. I'm comfortable with how life is for myself at the moment, and I don't want to get out of my comfort zone. Someone on our team wrote down, unhealthy conflict. There are some people that I don't get on with, and I have an unresolved issue, so I don't want to see them. Maybe for some it was a lack of unity. I don't like these people. I feel awkward or uncomfortable. What do we have in common? Someone wrote down miscommunication. I don't know how and when. What would be on your list if you were writing it down? What would you suggest it might be a part of it? I suspect that for most of us, it's kind of like a combination of different things. We all have things which kind of trigger us, you know what I mean? Things which are more applicable to who we are as people. But as I read through that list, I notice in my mind and heart where most of the issue lies. It's not in programs, but in attitudes. It was asking me, what do I really value? Or what do I make a priority in my life? It's kind of how I read it for myself. How do you read it? Does anything provoke or challenge or stir you? You see, I want to tell you today, I just want to say, there is a richness to a spiritual life when we come together. There is a richness to a spiritual life when we come together which does not just come from being alone. You know, the early church recognised that. In Acts chapter 2, we read this story about what was happening in one of the early churches. It says that all of the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to sharing in meals, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. All the believers met together in one place. They shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions, shared the money with those in need. They worshipped together at the temple, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, shared their meals with joy and generosity. Do you hear the expression of that shared life? They all devoted. They shared meals. The sense of awe was not just an individual sense of awe, but it was over everyone. They shared everything, money. They worshipped together. You see, there is a richness to the spiritual life that cannot be replicated when we're alone. It just cannot. The first line of a paragraph that we have describing this as a church says, we are a diverse family united by God's love, seeking to be followers of Jesus. What does that mean to be diverse? And we might think in terms of background, of age or gender, ethnicity. You might think of like our lives, our experiences, our personalities, our gifts. There is a richness with that diversity when it comes together. In the late 1990s, there was a study commissioned into the key factors that determined whether a young person who had become a Christian would continue their journey of faith throughout all of their life. It was an important study, and the results were somewhat surprising. Most important was not a Pied Piper youth pastor. Most important was not a fantastic church with a smoke and lights rock band. Most important was not inspiring, engaging preaching. Most important was not a church family or even great Christian friends. No, the number one predictor for a young person walking with Jesus for life was that person knows 5 older people of faith who know them. It's the number one predictor. Not many people would have guessed it. There is a richness in the spiritual life when we come together that you cannot have apart. You see, we are stronger and deeper in faith when we would say that we have intergenerational community and ministry. That's part of what we want to do at this particular church. We want to celebrate that diverse nature as a gift, not as an anchor. And for some places, I've got to say, if I was a marketing executive, I would say that's just stupid. It's much easier, Andrew, to appeal to the individual's needs and preferences. It's much easier to do it that way. You know what? If you were a group here today of just people between the age of 55 and 65, and all from the same background, it would be much easier to determine a useful program if you were something you were buying. You'd probably enjoy the same music, understand the same illustrations, want to gather in the same places, maybe even eat the same food. It would be much easier. It's harder to speak to a 65-year-old and a 12-year-old at the same time. It's harder to share in music for the same groups of people. It's harder in any way to gather when you've got different groups. It would be much easier if everybody was the same. But it's much better when you're not. It's much richer. It's much more engaging. And that's why we are committed to this sense of together. Let me tell you, I ask you this question. Would Croydon Hills Baptist Church, for those of you who haven't been with us for very long, we have an ethnic, a refugee community, our Karen community, who are part of our church community. People who have come from horrible situations in Burma, living out of refugee camps. The average person probably has the education of a grade 6 person who's grown up in Australia. Completely different experience. Completely different way of looking and seeing the world. Completely different. Now, would it be easier to lead and manage Croydon Hills if we didn't have to think about our Karen community? I've got to say it would be. It would be easier. It's hard to think in 2 different ways. It's hard to process. And I've been doing it here now for nearly 10 years, and Moo and I have been working alongside each other for that entire... It's not easy. But would we be poorer? Yes, by far. Because there is a richness when we come together that you cannot just experience with yourself. There is a depth. There is a joy. You know, if you're a parent here and you have little children, you probably feel like this at some point in time. I hope that my kid doesn't make a whole lot of noise and distract other people. I want to say that I love it when your kid makes a lot of noise and distracts other people. I love it because there's joy in that whole breadth of life. When we come together, there is a richness, there is a strength, there is a joy that is much, much greater than if we just met by ourselves or with people like ourselves. You know, I want to say to you today, in fact, I don't want to say to you, I want to invite you. I want to invite you to participate in this joy of coming together. I want to invite you to take active steps, not only to come with purpose, but also to seek out purpose. Come with intention about building a deep, a rich community that shares life together. I want to invite you to be part of that journey, to encounter that richness of joy that I know is there. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to a church in Corinth, and at times, frankly, it's a scathing letter. In fact, the letter is defined by the issues that he talks about. In fact, if you're reading in your own time, sometimes you might want to note at the start of a bunch of chapters it says, now in reference to this, now in reference to this. Now it's like a checklist of things that he had to write to them about. This was a church that was divided. It was divided over leadership. I like this person, and some were saying, I like this person, and some were saying, I like this person. Some of them were divided over position and status, because Corinth was a wealthy, multicultural, sophisticated city for those times. And so there was different economic positions. Some were kind of slaves or poor. Some were wealthy and educated. In chapter 11, he writes these words. He says, in the following instructions, I cannot praise you. There's the first slap. For it sounds as if more harm than good is done when you meet together. Second slap. First, I hear there are divisions among you when you meet as a church, and to some extent I believe it. But of course there must be divisions among you so that you who have God's approval will be recognised. A third slap. Some of them felt they were more important, that they were God's special people. When you meet together, you are not really interested in the Lord's Supper. For some of you are in a hurry to eat your own meal without sharing with others. Another slap. As a result, some go hungry while others get drunk. Another one. What, don't you have your own homes for eating and drinking? Or do you really want to disgrace God's church and shame the poor? Another backhander. What am I supposed to say? Do you want me to praise you? Well, I certainly will not praise you for this. There's some great words in a letter that you would receive, aren't they? And this is the core, because he wants to remind them. He wants to remind them of what unites them. For I pass on to you what I received from the Lord himself. On the night when he was betrayed, Lord Jesus took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took a cup of wine after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood. Do this in remembrance of me as often as you drink it." You know, in a moment or three, we're going to share in communion together. And if you don't have communion things at the moment, maybe you want to kind of sneakily put a hand up or something like that if you've missed something on the way in, and one of our team will help to get you something. The church is a unique family. We're not gathered by age group. We don't gather by education. We don't gather by ethnicity. Not by job or social status. A church is a family gathered by God. The word community comes from a Latin word, communitas. It simply means something that you own together, something that you use together, essentially something that you have in common. Churches at their best, at their richest, are when all sorts of people gather from all sorts of places. But what do we have in common? What we have is that we gather around Jesus. We gather around Jesus because we each recognise that for all of who we are, ultimately that we are made by God, that we need to be reconciled to God, and that we have our hope in Jesus. That's what draws us together. That's the bond which ties us together. And so I want to invite you to do, I think one of the musos is going to come up and play some stuff in a moment or two. I invite you to take the communion elements that were distributed to you earlier on. And in that communion element it has a wafer. As Paul spoke about bread that was shared. As he quoted from Jesus, "This is my body given for you, to do this in remembrance of me." And a cup with some juice in it, to drink and to remind us of Jesus' blood that was shared for us. And I want to ask you, I'm going to invite you in a moment or two just to take them and share with me. But as you do so, I'm asking you to not only consider your commitment to Jesus for this life-giving meal that we share, but for your commitment to each other, because this is what gathers us. This is what says, my life is not just about me. My life is not just about me as an individual. It's about belonging together.